Oh, wow. I've been trying for the last hour not to look backwards because I felt like it was picking up a little bit and I didn't want to throw up before my talk here. So I also noticed a lot of people filing in were young architects, young designers, students here as well. And so in planning for my talk, I was going to just sort of jump right to the work, but I think I'm going to back up a little bit and tell you a little bit of an intro to kind of my practice and how it sort of started, because I think, when I'm talking to students and young practitioners, I feel like, it's sometimes difficult to see yourself in the position of the person who might already have some work and have built a bit of a career for themselves. And I remember thinking when I was a student that, it would be really nice to just know how they got there and, find a way to connect yourself to that person and see yourself. And I remember back in, I think, 2002, Molo came to do a talk at Dow, where I went to school. And I remember thinking, these people went to my school and they're doing these incredible things now. And I specifically remembered when they came that I remember thinking I wanted to be like that. Like I wanted to have a story like they had. And so you keep these things as you're going. So I grew up in Brampton, Ontario, a suburb of Toronto. I ended up going to the University of Toronto after completely getting rejected at the University of Waterloo. And so I'd hate for the U of T to think that it was a backup, but it was kind of the closest place to go to do architecture. Really, at that point, in my third year of school, I had just decided I had enough of the city, and I was looking to move as far away from Toronto as possible. And I ended up very sort of randomly, and it's almost difficult for me to look back and think how it all happened, but I ended up, very quickly deciding I was going to go to school at a place where a lot of my professors had gone earlier in the 70s, 80s, at Tons, because it was a well-known school. And so I got on a plane and I moved out there, and really moving out to Halifax and going to that school changed my life forever, for sure. So Dalhousie is an interesting place because unlike a lot of schools of architecture, it's a place where you really learn how to make things with your hands. There's a real community. And I remember even being in class, a lot of my classmates were from out west here. And so people came from far away to go and learn and make things. That's one of the things that makes the school really well known, is this idea of the free lab. Every summer you have a building project where you get to put some materials together and actually feel what a 2x4 feels like and how you nail it together, and learning from your peers. And so this was one of the first projects we did that ended up getting some national press in Canadian Architect, and it was the photography that I took in this project. But I remember thinking that was, it felt like a really big thing at the time, and you have to sort of take that, and kind of ride that wave of momentum. So after school, I ended up going back to Toronto, and I worked at Young & Wright Architects, where I worked for a really, really small facet of their company. Young & Wright's now bought by IBI, so it's a huge company. But they had this almost like basement division of their company that just did custom residential. And it was very much kind of a Muskoka, cottagey, McMansion type thing. But I learned from technologists and architects, how to draw and how to go to site and talk to builders and build those sort of relationships. And so although it wasn't a direct line as to how that would translate in the work that I would do beyond, there's still something to take from those experiences for sure. Then after that, I went and worked for KPMB for a few years. And as a family decision at that point in 2007, with my wife at the time, we decided that we'd move back to Halifax. And so that was a big decision for me, moving away from my family and really settling back out east, and ended up working for a well-known firm out there for about a year and a half, and ended up finding myself losing my job about a year and a half later. And so there was this moment where I was all ready to kind of buckle down and work for someone, and you kind of see ahead and see where you're going to go, and all of a sudden there's a bit of a curveball that life throws you. And so that was really kind of that moment in 2010 where I ended up basically just sitting here in my attic, and I remember just thinking like, this isn't what I came here for. I don't know how to run a business. I don't know anybody. And so I remember just sort of sitting in my attic and, starting to work on things like, little tagline slogans and like, ridiculous little things that aren't really kind of building your business, but it feels like you're doing something at the time. And so I ended up working for a technologist who really just took on like basement renovations and like deck add-ons. And so for the first 6-8 months or so, I was doing a lot of that work just to really kind of get by and pay the bills. And that's really when a small miracle kind of happened. And it was really some friends of ours that lived in Liverpool, Nova Scotia. They came to me. They were both the town docs. Everybody knew who they were in town. And they said, we have a growing family. We have 2 kids now, and we're planning on growing the family. We'd like to put a little addition on the back. Didn't seem like a really big project, but for me, that was my first project, and I certainly wasn't going to let that sort of, slip through my fingers. And so I kind of went at that at the best I could. And so, you start thinking about things like, well, this is my own office now. I've worked for other people, and I saw how they did it. The process of designing, the idea of talking to clients and going to site, and kind of that methodology of designing. How do I do it? You've never asked yourself that question before. You may have done it in school a little bit, but these were sort of the first moments of trying to figure out what that was. It's so nice. I'm looking around and I see classmates of mine who I haven't seen in over 15 years, so that's really nice. So this project's in Liverpool, about an hour and a half south of Halifax. We ended up essentially taking this 100 and some odd year old house right on the main strip of Liverpool, kind of the main drag. Everybody knows that's the doctor's house. Everybody has their eyes on it. Liverpool's not unlike a lot of places all over the country and, over here in BC, where industry might be dying and there's an aging population. And it's one of those places that may have been, thriving at one point, but it's kind of just hanging on. So things like the town dock staying is a really important thing. And so it was really important to me, and I don't know that it was as important to them, that the project was really modest. When people are losing their jobs and industry is shutting down in pulp and paper and fishing, the last thing you want to do is kind of show up with this sort of bling kind of like, addition to your house. That's just not necessary. And so the idea with this project was to really just take the information, and really it was going to be a diagram of how the architecture worked. Nothing more, nothing less. And so it started with these diagrams. It was about looking out back to the backyard towards the river, an untapped view that hadn't been used. It was about taking advantage of the solar exposure, sun in the house that wasn't there before. And then most importantly, it was about modesty, using a modest material palette, but also kind of thinking about it almost like horse blinders, so that the front of the house maintained its real traditional quality, but on the back was where, there was a lot more glass and certainly a modern aesthetic. And so it really started like that. And so playing with these diagrams, so there was the current massing with an addition on the back that was done in the 70s, something that wasn't very well done and, easily kind of dismissed. Then you're looking at zoning, what's the maximum area they're going to allow us to do? And then the third one, which really was kind of the end product, is playing with punches. How do you control solar exposure, solar gain? So you're going to punch that top master bedroom back a little bit so that when the sun is really hot in the summer, you have cool shading. And same thing with the mass below, which is the living room. Just shading naturally without any gimmicks, gizmos. You're really just playing with the actual form of the building itself. And so that was also the beginning of kind of this ethic of design and thinking about things in 3D, not just in diagrams and sketches and going straight to kind of three-dimensional computer models. Even when it was just me and not an us in the studio, it was about making these models and playing with those little pieces of wood and, being able to walk around it and see what it's going to feel like and how it's going to work when you're playing with solar diagrams. And so this is it, almost this kind of chameleon type building where the front very much maintains its very local and familiar palette of eastern white cedar shingles. And then on the back, hence the name cedar and three textures, playing with vertical stripes of the same cladding. And so on the back, it's really this modern kind of intervention that looks out towards the water. Now, probably the most important part about this project, beyond kind of it being the first one, was the builder. And so we interviewed 3 people for this project, and the first 2 were very well-known guys in town who had built forever, and they were very comfortable with modern as well. But the third came in and absolutely knocked our socks off. It was like a no-brainer. And this person would end up becoming really a mentor to me, and happens to be a woman builder, Deborah Herman-Spartanelli, who was really kind of one of the first mentors I had with my own practice. Now, when I'm talking about my work, it's hard for me to not talk about the first 3 because they really go together as a set. Not just because I was in the attic at that point by myself, figuring out what I was doing, but also it was really trying to figure out what that process of design was going to be as I would move forward. And so what's interesting about this project was it really only came about because of that wonderful person, Deborah, who met with some clients not far along, maybe about 15, 20 minutes down the coast, who came to her and said, we have this cottage and we want to think about renovating it. Do you know anyone who's a designer around who could help with this? And she said, well, I'm working with this young guy. I was young then. And the bag's under my eyes now. They're crazy. But she was like, I'm working with this guy now. We just finished this other project in Liverpool. You should meet with them. And so I ended up going and met with these people, wonderful people. And they said, well, what do you think after we walked the site? And I remember just thinking, this could be pretty much the end. I could be like one project in and then that's the end of it. And I said, I think you should just demo it. I think you should get rid of it, and I don't think there's anything really redeeming about it. And it's that moment kind of like me waiting as long as possible to look around here at you guys. I didn't look at their eyes right away. And they said, that's exactly what we wanted to do. We were just sort of waiting. You feel wasteful to throw something in the garbage, but we don't really like it that much either. So let's do that. And so I went back to my desk and I said, well, there's this beautiful part of your property right here. You talked about it when we walked the site about your grandkids playing in this bowl, this grassy bowl, just behind the cottage, and that's where you guys sit and play. Everyone watches one another. And I said, well, what if, like mother's arms, or grandmother's arms in this case, they wrapped around this bowl? So no matter where you are in the building, you're actually just looking inward to where everyone is playing and congregating. And so from that idea came the idea of kind of a program that's wrapping around this bowl. A guest wing, kind of the main gathering area with the kitchen and living room, and then the ensuite area where they would have their own quarters, and really the ability to shut it down depending on who was around. And that translated really quickly into just playing with materials. It's like, these ideas, they're flat, and, you're playing with diagrams at that point. You feel almost this itch to get some card. And maybe it's the generation that, I went to school where we were still making physical models. It's like, we need to see what this looks like and test it out. So just with card, starting to play with the idea of that very traditional shed building that you see all over kind of the coastline of Nova Scotia and parts of our country. It's like, well, what if it was this contorted form that really wrapped around? And those models end up becoming a lot more complex and starting to think about structure. Starting to think about, how that thing actually plays out in scale. And becoming more detailed, starting to think about light from above and how you control solar gain again. And playing with ideas like this that might have, I think it probably felt to me very lofty at the time, but ideas like Frank Lloyd Wright would have done about compression and really kind of pushing the space down at the entry so that when you walk around that corner, not just with the light, but with the way that we handle the sound, it just felt like you opened up towards this kind of like unbelievable view that is entirely what Nova Scotia is known for. And so that every time you re-entered that space, it felt just as special. And now nothing, and even 9, 10 years later, there is nothing more exciting and kind of crazy than the thought of making really horrible card models and them starting to actually build it. It's sort of a thing that's hard to believe. And there's a photo that I can't find, but I remember when I did work at Young and Wright and I worked on one of those McMansion-y kind of cottages, I remember there's a photo of me standing in a foundation. And the smile on my face, because, well, part smile, part like kind of terrified in case I messed it up, but I drew that foundation and someone actually built it, which seems insane, right? And so that sort of thrill of seeing those big ideas come together, and ideas of light and contrast and feeling alone, but also feeling together with everyone. Ideas of texture and materiality. And then finally seeing it all come together. Even if you're there every week and only a little is done at a time, there's nothing more awe-inspiring than seeing that come together. So this on the entry side, where as you approach it, after your long drive, your hour-and-a-half drive from Halifax to the cottage, that's primarily tree-lined, and so you don't actually get a lot of view of the ocean as you're kind of in that last half an hour. And so the idea there is the scale of this side of the building is really low, and as you enter it, and you do turn that corner and see that view, you're not just seeing it for the first time on your property, it's actually the first time you've seen it in, your journey all the way there. And people always ask about this solution with the stone kind of lining in the fireplace. That's there for code, but now when you go back, that cedar has grayed out and really it's become kind of a completely sort of monolithic palette. And so this project ended up getting us some really nice attention, not just the project, but my collaboration with Deborah and the engineer that we worked with, Andrea Doncaster, who I use all the time. And so you can imagine, a trio like that being slightly unorthodox in a fairly kind of masculine, field. And so that project, there was an article that came out in the Globe and Mail for that one. And there was a couple that both read it on that Saturday morning and the husband ended up calling Deborah about this cottage they wanted to build, and the wife called me. And they both hadn't actually talked about it, but they had been thinking, like, who's going to build our thing? This sounds perfect, and it's right in our backyard. And so it was too far out for them, but this is actually, well, that's obviously me. And that's Deborah next to me, and these are the wonderful clients who commissioned this job. And, I look back and I think of this project, Shanti, it's just like there was absolutely no reason at all for these people to trust me to do something so important for them. I had nothing up till that point, but for some reason, they gave me the complete green light to go for it and do it. You can't forget people like that. So this project, after reading that article, it ended up being too far for Deborah to build, and so I ended up taking it on. And this was basically a couple that they're nearing retirement. They had previously been living in a basement apartment in Halifax, and they were artists before they had children. They ended up getting, kind of standard jobs to pay the bills and really sort of lost track of their passion for the arts. And so they bought this property in the forest, not far from Halifax, maybe about 45 minutes away. And this was going to be it. They were going to be alone in this wooded landscape where they were going to just daily be able to make the things they wished they'd been making for the last 20 years. And so that same process of taking these very familiar forms, in this case a 12-12 gable, and playing with this little hillside that the site was, it was sort of the main characteristic of it, and starting to contort it. So, playing with that roof form, making very few kind of moves to really take advantage of kind of the peculiar aspects of the client and the program and the site itself, the few moves as possible. And so that ended up becoming this sketch here, which was really just about this thing that was climbing up the hill and really had these long, uninterrupted views of the woods. There's one thing about wanting to feel alone in the woods in this scenario is sort of like you feel really alone when you can see all of the nothingness around you. It's different than just being kind of enclosed somewhere, but to actually just see the nothingness. And so again, playing with those models, starting to think about materiality and kind of those gentle moves that allow for light and kind of, the specific program that they were going to use. And so this project was really, really a labor of love for not just me, but for a lot of people. Like I said, they had been previously living in a basement apartment. There wasn't a big budget on this project, but there was really a will to do something special. And so as we were interviewing builders for this project, this young guy comes up to me. He had just started his construction company, had tattoos all over his body, and was like, "Look, I want to build your project." And I was like, "Well, that's very aggressive to just come to someone's house and do that." But we ended up going with it, and it was, I was intimidated. And it was really about this, just sort of like sweat, people just working to prove themselves, just as I was sort of doing in that stage of my career as well. And so ideas of, again, kind of isolation and being alone, but also being together where it's needed, not being afraid to be kind of high contrast or dramatic. You can kind of achieve a lot just by really thinking about it and looking around you. And so this steel gate here, the screen, that was just in the steel trash bin at the kind of, I think it's called like Metals R Us, believe it or not. It was at the back and it was under a pile, and we're like, yes, it's, what can we have that for? That's going to be the screen. These hanging lights are probably not the kind of lights that you'd see in this store. They were literally like, a hanging bulb from Canadian Tire that we kind of jimmied together to make this. And then these like louvers made of hemlock that are just cantilevering out. Really just playing with texture and the material of very, very basic materials. And so in the end, it looks exactly like the model. So there really isn't that point where, the sketch and the model then starts to lose those ideas. It's about kind of carrying it right till you complete it. Now, like looking back at photos like this, like the other project, they were such special moments in kind of the starting of a company and really feeling inspired. You have to sort of take those highs and run with it. As a young business or someone trying to find their way, there are plenty of lows. You have to hang on to the highs and just run as hard as you can. And so what's really special about this photo for me was this was the last day. And this is the team of builders with me at the back and the client in the front. Everybody had cameras on site that day to take photos because they were so proud to show their boyfriends and girlfriends and parents what they'd been working on for the last year. And so again, that idea of kind of sweat and passion going into something to make very simple things into something special. And so from that first three, you look back at what feels natural, what feels right for design in my own studio, and I start thinking, well, I think I have something here. I called it adaptation. So our projects begin with a simple local precedent, often a hip roof or gable form. The form is then extruded up or across, bent or flattened, the roof planes folded and pleated. Sculpted by conditions in use, the reconstituted adaptation is receptive and responsive in its keeping with a modest formal lineage. It was very simple, and this ended up becoming sort of the recipe for the work that I was going to do, which then got applied to the work that followed. And so at that point, I did move out of my extremely lonely attic space And I hired one person, and this person here is Jeff Shaw, who's been with me since 2012. And we had this little space here, and really we just put our head down and just started grinding. And so we start dotting the landscape. And of course, at that point, we're hiring one other person, hiring some students. There's a couple of us at this point, and we just start firing away. And so starting to take that strategy, that formula that we've produced, and playing with very familiar forms and very familiar materials, and trying to do something special with it in a quiet way. And then in 2014, was able to move just down the hall into a slightly bigger space, a few projects under our belt, and was able to hire a couple more people. And again, we continue. And really, we start experimenting with different things at this point. So we're playing with retail. We're starting to play with, different kinds of residential. I should stop and say that the reason I'm here today is because of Emma Peter, who is, your local superstar. She's, as you know, one of the best photographers in the world, if not the best. And we've had the opportunity to bring her out for 3 or 4 projects now. And it's made all the difference in our studio to work with the best people. And then in 2016, I just felt like it was time. It was like a different thing where, now I was going back to Toronto, having left as, a student, someone like kind of 7th on the, the list of a huge project working on ceilings, and then coming back and having kind of already built a little portfolio for myself. We now have, 5 people working there, and a different kind of work that we work on. So I'm going to flip through a couple projects here, but I'd like to talk a little bit more in depth about a few. And these were all shot by Emma. So I'll go into this one, and there's a few I'll talk about. So Sluice Point, which really is on the southern tip almost of Nova Scotia. It's unique in that it's an Acadian area. And so like a lot of the places where the Acadians were banished to, they certainly weren't good for farming. And really just weren't ideal plots of land at all. And they were like, you go there. But they made do. And so one of the things I remember seeing when we made that first visit out to that area were these haystacks that are raised up on wooden stilts that really take it up above this marshy, horrible landscape to dry hay. And it's almost a very specific kind of unique thing that's in this Acadian village. And so when you close your eyes, you almost see it as if it's a growth in the landscape, almost this little kind of blemish that grows from the ground itself. And so the idea here with this project, this was for a Swiss client who came to us and actually didn't just bring us the project. We ended up competing for it, and they gave us a stipend, and they gave another firm a stipend, and we ended up just going, it was just Jeff and I at the time. We went absolutely bananas trying to win this first competition ever. And basically, we ended up winning the project, and it was really just about this idea of this growth in the landscape. This low, long form that if you squint your eyes, it doesn't actually take away from this untouched rural area. It actually just makes it special. So again, these card models, and starting to play with these diagrams of how you can take these regional forms and start to bend it and pleat it to fit around this peninsula that's shot out. And so this was the first project here, which is this one. And so this plan that really aims to almost condense your view, this tall, skinny view that once you go inside, it almost flips the orientation. It's low and long and infinite. And so this is the peninsula, and this is that first building here. So there's a long drive before you actually get to it in this long driveway. And so you end up really having your view blocked. This idea of withholding is kind of, one of these things that we repeat a lot in our work to kind of build this anticipated drama. And this was actually a drawing done by a student who worked with us. I knew he was an incredible artist, and I just said, you know what, Carl, I don't know how long it's going to take you to do this, but I think you have the opportunity here to do something absolutely special. And he basically sat for a month with cotton balls and graphite dust drawing these clouds here. And he's actually won numerous awards for this drawing. And it's those sort of things we try and do in our studio. That doesn't make you money when you're trying to grow a business. But that's the joy of it. I always tell people, what's the difference between when you're in school and when you're running a practice? Well, ideally, there should be no difference. You should be working at it exactly the same way. And so that roof form is actually really complex, but the budget, again, wasn't very big. This is Nova Scotia. There are no big budgets. And so we actually, even when a Swiss client is coming, the reason he's coming there is because you can build something with a very little budget, right? So, what we did here was we actually took that extremely complex roof form and did it entirely with prefab trusses. And so every single truss itself is completely unique. And so the reason we made this model, and Andre is here, who worked with me, he built this here. The reason we actually built it ourselves and put it together is you just can't trust people, and you can't necessarily trust the truss manufacturer that there isn't going to be some weird thing sticking up here or whatever, right? So, you put it together to make sure that those lines down the hip actually work the way they're supposed to. And we're psycho. And so actually seeing this come together in that same form, is the fun of our job, really. The entire structure, the roof and the walls, are made with eastern white cedar shingles, including the ridges here, which are all lapped custom shingles. So it's really a work of art, and it took a long time for them to do it. So again, this idea of taking one orientation and then completely flipping it on the inside. And this thing that really feels, again, when you squint your eyes, as if it's part of the landscape, the landform itself, but then at night it becomes this creature in the wild. So I first went to this property back in 2012, 2013. McIsaac was the owner, and his family had basically owned it for, I think he said, around 300 years. And so as they first came over to the New World, essentially their family ended up settling on this piece of land in Cape Breton, and so knew it very well. And so what made this property really special, and this is the landscape here in that area, what made it really special was that it wasn't actually good for farming. It wasn't good to raise animals. It was actually just a place for kids to play. And he remembered as kids, that's where their grandfather would take them to go learn how to snare rabbits. And so this was a project for a New Jersey attorney who had basically owned this property for a couple years, from Lawrence McIsaac, and basically decided he wanted to build these little pavilions. As you're sort of trekking through this landscape here that has this river and a little waterfall over here, and then you come to the edge and there is a massive cliff, not unlike the one I showed you there. It's about this storytelling. It's telling this narrative. And so the first project was over here, the cabin. And so the idea wasn't to actually have that coastal view on the edge. It was actually to look out towards where that building and where that landscape would be. So you're looking through that valley out to kind of the conclusion of the story. And so again, thinking about height, thinking about regional form, taking that really steep gable this time, and starting to play with it so that from every little part of this cabin, you actually have a different view of something special, whether you're looking out at the forest or looking back at the waterfall or down that valley itself. As you're winding your way up, you're seeing something else that's different. Now, this is a really windy area, a place that's really famous for wind. And so one of the things here, again, with a low budget and using kind of Andrea Doncaster as our engineer, really thinking about bracing. How do you use just nominal lumber and hold down clips to, ensure that this thing stays in place? And so, that ended up becoming a really interesting thing to model to really kind of test out how those ideas work. Now, we're always looking, and we didn't design this, we're always looking for those unique qualities. We're trying to tell stories through architecture itself. And so one of the things you see a lot of in Newfoundland and parts of Nova Scotia are these windbreaks. And usually it's made from plywood or plastic or something really kind of as an afterthought that's plunked on there so that your door doesn't shut or swing open, and it's also a place to have a smoke and not get wet when it's raining out. And so we took that idea, and I said to the client, what would be really cool, again, this like brace yourself kind of moment, is if we did this with a 2-ton Corten steel hoop that was 24 feet high. And he was like, yes, let's do it, And that really ended up becoming kind of the icon of the project, is this entry hoop that really speaks to this tradition of the windbreak in this extreme climate. Clad entirely in local cedar, and these strip windows up the back just to give you a little hint of life inside almost as you're climbing the stairs. I'll go back just for a sec. So this wonderful guy here, Andre Cott, used to work for me. He's way over there, hiding at the back. And I remember asking him to model in this shoot. And I was like, I just need you to stand there. And, there's going to be a few different views, but you're going to be there. And I remember him thinking, this is really cool, right? This is really great. But what I didn't tell him was that the reason we picked him is because he's not very tall. And I picked him out of the studio, and I was like, this is going to make Rabbit Snare Gorge seem really tall. See, look how cool he is there, right? He doesn't know that. I would never have told him that beforehand. So that was the first of a few projects on that site. But again, this idea of these creatures in the wild. And so I ended up teaching at Yale last semester and had the privilege of bringing my students to Cape Breton, where we actually took this property, and the project for the term was to design these creatures in the wild. And so it kind of stemmed from this idea of looking at regional forms and materials, but starting to play with these kind of interesting small buildings. And so this was the second building that got built. It's actually for kayak storage and a wood shop. And so just using steel frames and entirely cladding it out of wood. And this happened, I think, around the time my son was, 2 or 3 years old and really getting into transformers. And so I think part of me was sort of doing this to impress him. So we made this building essentially like a transformer, where there's 4 doors on the sides that all fold up, and then this huge gate out the front that peels down where you can drive an ATV out of it and slide your canoes out as well. The Lookout. So not far from there. So a lot of the projects we did are in the Inverness area and Cape Breton. This one was for Toronto clients that essentially bought this really, really narrow piece of land. And even when they bought it, I think the locals thought these people are crazy. You can't really build a house on it. It's so narrow and there's a huge cliff over here. And it was really just thought of as the lookout. It's where people would stop over and they would take in the view looking back at the coastline. And so we went to them and we said, you know, I think we could totally do something just by this back wall and really creating a linear bar building that looked out towards the water. But in this area, like I was saying with the last project, the climate is very extreme. So you have wind not just rolling in from the ocean, but actually from the hillside behind it. And so really it was about coming up with a form. We did not design that either. No, we did not. But this was, the reason I have this in here is actually this idea of taking almost these post-war, standard buildings that people would buy from a catalog, and then everyone does these sort of pod type things, whether for an entry or extending the bedroom or the living room itself. There's a real sort of culture of taking the standard and doing your own thing to it. And so that was something we carried over in this project, the idea of these pods. And so this is the coastline here, and this is the property with this very long building and a long shed roof that essentially is just manipulated in a very, very gentle way to allow for more light in the main gathering space. And so this idea of playing with these pods that slide in and this back wall that has all the cabinetry and millwork in it, and that's backed up against the bank behind it. And a roof form that really, feels aggressive. Instead of, the standard of the roof going up, looking out towards the view, this is almost bracing itself. It has its hood or its hat down low, so you can almost not see, someone's eyes. It's sort of cutting into the wind itself and very aggressive, with just one little eyebrow sticking up. Andre wasn't around for this one. You can see it's not gentle water. The wind is very intense. So the idea here was that it's really back braced. It's really just hunkered down and lying really low and trying to be aerodynamic. And a final project I'll talk about, Float. So this is actually just slightly out of Halifax, and probably one of the reasons I love the city that I live in is that only 10 minutes away from downtown, you're essentially in the wild, and there are untouched pieces of land that are available, really. And that's why a lot of our clients that come to us, whether from Switzerland or from the States or other parts of Canada, it's just, you really can't buy land that beautiful for that kind of price. And so this, not being far out from the city, this is actually called the Purcell's Cove Backlands, and it's a real glacial valley that really has left these very, very kind of odd outcroppings, these huge granite boulders that are strewn across the landscape and really just make the land itself useful for hiking and mountain biking. But this wonderful client of ours, she bought this piece of land, and behind it was a huge boulder. So this was really kind of back there. And so the idea for us was to look out towards this view, but to use that boulder to the best of our abilities, to really kind of back up into it. So it almost feels like the building itself is part of that landscape. So again, taking those regional forms, taking that standard shape, the shed building, and starting to play with it in 3 dimensions this time, not just opening it up, but actually tapering it out on the sides. The idea with this project, float is a term used to describe outcroppings which have actually fallen from its place. So it's geological float. And so this is essentially meant to mimic the idea of kind of rock that's broken free. And so the landscape itself that we used tried to use the natural landscape. So, even as you're walking through the house, the topography remained unchanged. So you're sort of climbing up and winding your way up through that ground level. So this was the site here looking at a series of lakes, and then you have the wide open ocean over here. And this is the massive boulder that it backed up onto. So upon entering, you actually enter through one of the gaps. So you sort of filter in through it, and then you start winding through the program. And so as I was saying, in section, you're also stepping. And so again, that idea, that just awe-inspiring act of actually seeing your completely ridiculous ideas being built is something that I hope never gets old. The garage itself was actually, although formally the same as these other buildings, we made it with open gap slats just so that it became a lantern at night and really kind of broke up the form even more. Now, so you can laugh at this, that's okay. So I mentioned Jeff Shaw earlier, who's been with me for a long time now. And one of the things that's interesting about him is after he leaves work, he actually just goes to his own shop where he works on cafe racers. And so he works with someone else and he builds these incredible motorcycles that he shows around the world. And so this seemed to me, or no, to him, like a really good opportunity to shoot one of his bikes. And so I said, yeah, okay, of course. Like, why wouldn't we do that? That seems like a great idea. And then I turned my head for a second and literally produces this, which then went on to become, online dating profile, which I paid for. But fortunately, he's now engaged and, so it all worked, and I feel like that's the bonus. Like, no bonus coming for the next little while. I always end with the list of the people who work with me and have worked for me because we have so much fun together. Really, I talk about watching projects get built, but I love my job. I love being in the studio because we have the best time. We laugh kind of all day. And so, it's to credit to all of these people that, we've produced some nice work over the last few years. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That's great. You're willing to take a few questions?
Sure, yeah.
Anyone have any questions?
I'd like to know more about your relationship with your woman builder, how that influenced you, and in what ways.
Okay. Well, really, she had actually lived off-grid, raised her kids alone, and ended up becoming a Red Seal carpenter. And what's actually amazing about that is that most people who we've worked with, or even builders in the area, they actually don't go through all that certification. So she had to do that much more. But really, it's just, the main thing was being so green and not really understanding the building industry, not understanding necessarily how things go together. It was very much, an kind of orthodox sort of relationship where I was really relying on her feedback a lot. And when my son was born, she actually knit a hat for him, and that was the first gift that I got. So we ended up becoming very close, and it's those kind of like things that happen that you can't, I said before, you really just can't forget about. And I haven't been able to work with her for the last little while. She's, I think, for the most part, retired now, but she's just an incredible, incredible person. Yeah.
Any other questions?
This might not be that exciting of a question, but were those buildings off grid? Like, how did you were they all connected to the grid and the water and the electricity and everything?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, they are. I wish I had a more exciting answer for you there. I feel like that was disappointing.
So if you show...
Like the relationship to the builder question. I was like, I'm just disappointing you guys with...
I was gonna... If you show your buildings to an envelope consultant, I think they'd be the first person to have a seizure.
Yeah.
So how did you grow into detailing those kinds of forms with no overhangs, that kind of thing, as a young architect? And I assume you're an expert at it now.
Yeah, we are. And I would say that, with every project that we work with a new builder, we go through the same kind of battles. But really, it's just kind of showing them in the details, It's sort of like we have that rain screen and we have, this much of an overlap in terms of flashing. It's getting really dry now, eh? It's your fault. But, I think people are often nervous about, water pouring down the side of their building, but it's how people did it, Like, it's sort of a time-proven thing. And also, we try and do everything in our power to not have gutters.
Maybe this one's more interesting. I don't know. The scale that you've done is quite small in houses. Do you have ambitions to do larger projects, or do you quite like the scale and the poetry that is kind of working at that scale and with people and families?
Yeah, I really only showed kind of the work that we had done and completed to date, but we actually have a high-rise building that we're working on in Toronto, where we were brought on as designers. In Lunenburg, we're doing a huge municipal building. We've worked on a couple of restaurants. We have a commercial building we just completed. So there is kind of a bunch of things that are happening slowly, but we're very sort of selective about the work we take on and people's ambitions. And I'd say that probably one of the things I'm most proud of is, even with the opportunity to grow, we've kept a very small core in both offices. We have a very small team. There's 10 of us total. And what that allows us to do is to say no to things. And it's literally, I don't think any project or any amount of money is more valuable than having that kind of control, to just work with good people who have ambition and want to go on this amazing ride with you. We don't know where the process is going to lead us, but they're just as excited about not knowing as well. And so I think that's it. It's just kind of being as selfish as possible, because that's the best part of the job, just working with people and working on cool things. Yeah.
Wow. Great. Yeah. I totally agree. Someone else? Yes?
What are some mistakes you've made in your professional career that you'd like to share?
I don't know about, I'll tell you, the thing that really sort of like weighs heavily is that when you have to lay someone off. You know, those sort of parts of the business are really painful, and you know that's happened a couple times where you know you have to say, you know, deliver that message to really good people. I'd say that's something, but in terms of, you know, having regrets, I really don't have any. Because I surround myself with really good people, and, you know, I follow my heart, and I think at the end of the day, you can maybe wish you did something different, but you wouldn't have, you know. Yeah. Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do all of it, and we prefer to. I think maybe part of that is where, you know, I had worked previously at KPMB. They are very heavy into that stuff. But the main thing, again, and it's going to sound horrible, like, you know, picking your projects, it's about control. And so when you can, it's pretty nice to be able to do the whole package. And work with the client. You know, we've worked with interior designers and we've had great experiences, but, you know, in an ideal world, we're sort of doing all that stuff.
Thank you, Omar.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thank you.